Welcome to the Nurse Mark Podcast, where we talk about everything health, happiness, cannabis. We'll delve into all aspects of what it means to live a powerful, healthy life. Everything from exercise to nutrition to mindfulness, and how to use cannabis as a means to alleviate some of the most common health issues we face. My motivation and passion come from the fact that I personally had to explore all these areas to deal with lifelong depression and mood disorder. For me, it's personal. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Nurse Mark Podcast. This week, I have as a guest, OLeary Randall. Now, if you've never heard her name before, you are in for a treat. Alice and her husband, Robert, are really the founders of the medical marijuana movement. Robert, her husband, was diagnosed with glaucoma, and he determined that using cannabis, marijuana, helped him with his glaucoma, and he successfully won a case against the federal government, and they had to provide him with medical marijuana. That happened in 1976. It's the first time that it happened. And oh my gosh, you're going to love this episode. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. All right, folks, welcome to the Nurse Mark Podcast. My guest today is OLeary Randall. Oh my gosh, Alice, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you on the Nurse Mark Podcast today.
Well, thank you
for joining. Thank you for joining from sunny Florida.
More or less sunny. Yes, thank you.
Yes, more or less sunny.
Yeah.
So, Alice, you have the most amazing story. You and your husband were ground zero for the medical marijuana movement.
That's correct. In fact, I've sometimes heard my husband referred to as patient zero.
Patient zero.
In the medical marijuana movement. And it's true. Prior to Bob's case, there was not any medical marijuana in America. And I know that seems impossible to some of your listeners, but literally in the mid-1970s, people didn't know about medical marijuana use. The Marijuana Prohibition Act of 1937 had done a great job at totally erasing the concept of medical cannabis use from American consciousness.
That just blows me away because it was part of the medical treatment of the day, right? So for 100 years or more, it was part of what doctors used very effectively in the treatment of a lot of different things. And then 1937 shut the door on that.
Yeah, it was falling into a bit of disuse at that period of time because pharmaceuticals were entering the golden age. A lot of the very first pharmaceuticals that we're so familiar with today, like penicillin, even aspirin, was being made into pharmaceutical forms that were much more pleasing, if you will, to the culture. And of course, cannabis is notoriously difficult to work with in some forms. So it was falling into a bit of disuse. And actually, there's a funny story with respect to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The American Medical Association really got completely caught flat-footed on that because they called it the Marijuana Tax Act, and doctors, of course, didn't know what marijuana was. They were accustomed to cannabis,
right? And
so somebody at the last minute, as I understand it from my readings, somebody said, "Hey, this is about cannabis." And so the AMA lobbyist, who was William Woodward, or Woodard maybe, but he rushed to Capitol Hill and said, please don't prohibit medical use because, as he put it, future research may reveal new uses for the drug. And I found that quote years ago and thought it was so prescient and obviously correct.
Obviously correct.
Yeah, but Congress didn't listen to the American Medical Association, and they passed.
Of course not. Why listen to the people who know what they're doing?
Right,
the
right.
ones who have experience, right?
Right. And so it was just 5 years later that the government managed to get rid of it from the pharmacopoeia. That was in 1942. And so that was really the death knell of cannabis as medicine for the next, 50 years or so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then Bob had glaucoma.
Yes. My late husband, Robert Randall, had glaucoma. He was diagnosed very young. He was 24 years old.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was very advanced by the time they diagnosed it. He was told he'd be blind by the time he was 30. And needless to say, that's really devastating news when you're that young. It is. He had moved to Washington, D.C. after graduate school, and I met Bob in college. And we smoked marijuana. We inhaled.
Shocking! It's the 70s. It's college. I think you weren't alone.
Yeah, exactly. We were hippies, and so we smoked a lot of marijuana while we were in college. But then we graduated. We went our separate ways for a while, and our connections dried up. We just didn't have that much access to marijuana, and that was certainly true in Bob's case. He was in Washington, D.C., driving a cab of all things, hoping to become a speechwriter. But he noticed these visual problems and got himself diagnosed. And he was at home one night. Actually, the diagnosis was really devastating to him on many levels because he could no longer drive a cab.
Oh, so there goes his
livelihood was gone. And he went on welfare and food stamps for a while he tried to get the medications settled. And one night he was at home and he looked out the window and he saw one of the telltale signs of elevated interocular pressure, which is tricolored halos around streetlights. And he kind of sighed and was, depressed.
Yeah. Who wouldn't be at that point?
Well, who wouldn't be? And so he'd been given a joint by a newfound friend. And he decided, well, I'm just going to put on some music and smoke this joint and try to forget about things for a while. And so that's what he did. And about 20 minutes later, he got up to go to the kitchen to get a can of Coca-Cola. And he looked out the window and the tricolored halos were gone. And he immediately put it together in his head. He wrote about it in our book. He called it a singular motion, a singular moment. And in retrospect, it was his endocannabinoid system just firing up like crazy.
Right.
But of course, then he just went, "Well, I'm stoned," which of course he was.
Well, yeah, but with a positive effect.
Right.
I mean, here, it's amazing that it was just this singular moment where he had looked out and saw this, this tricolored halo.
He knew
and
it,
then he didn't.
Yes. And in retrospect, we heard this so many times over the years from other patients, regardless of the disease, that there was that moment where biologically, they knew that this stuff was really helping them. This cannabis was what they needed.
Right.
But then they doubt it and go, "Oh no, I was stoned."
Right. Right.
But then every time that you would use it, the phenomena would repeat itself. And so bit by bit, Robert proved it to himself methodically. But he didn't tell anybody because there was no medical marijuana then.
And who would listen to him?
And he told me, and quite frankly, Mark, I laughed. I did.
So you too, you said, "Bob, you're stoned."
Yeah, you're stoned. You just want another excuse to get stoned.
Right.
And so, but with time, it became very obvious to me that this really was helping him. And so we did what we needed to do to keep him in supplies of marijuana. That included growing marijuana, for which we got busted in 1975. And not long after that, we learned that there was indeed evidence that marijuana could help glaucoma patients collected by the federal government. And I have to say that made my husband absolutely furious. He got so mad about that.
And why wouldn't he?
Right.
They held back. Obviously they held back on this information. It wasn't.
I don't know that I'd characterize it that way, Mark. It's
Really?
not that they held it back. It's just that the only people they bothered to tell was the U.S. Congress in an annual report from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which went up to Capitol Hill and was looked at and then put in some box for storage.
Well, if you think about it, they have so many reports that they get on their desk. That's probably the last one that anybody actually read. And if it was read by an intern or somebody.
Precisely.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and buried in that report was a one or two paragraphs about potential therapeutic applications. And so the information was there, but nobody was paying attention to it, which happens.
Sure.
But we were now paying very serious attention to it because we'd been arrested. And Bob managed to find the ophthalmologist who had concluded that one of the physiological effects of marijuana use was lowering of the intraocular eye pressure. And Bob got himself to UCLA, where this ophthalmologist was located. And for 10 days in 1975, he was tested with every conceivable glaucoma medication and marijuana. And they did all kinds of, they'd only test the glaucoma medications. Then they'd test him only on the marijuana. Then they'd test him on THC pills. And after all of that testing, it was concluded that it was the addition of marijuana cigarettes to Robert's conventional glaucoma medications that made the difference.
And that combination
unlocked
the door to him.
Precisely.
Yeah, having lower intraocular pressure.
Armed with that, we fought the charges against us, and Bob was found not guilty by reason of medical necessity. And we also petitioned the federal government for permission to use their marijuana, which was granted in November of 1976. At the same time, within a week of that, the judge's decision came down of not guilty by reason of medical necessity. And that was big news around the world, actually.
Yeah.
Certainly here in the U.S. And the medical marijuana movement was born at that point. I actually had a call one time from a lexicographer who had determined that the term medical marijuana did not exist before Bob's case. It literally the term did not exist prior to November of 1976. So Bob truly was the founder of the medical marijuana movement. We immediately began to hear from others, and the movement was born.
And that was it. Off you went. Yeah. What was it like being arrested for growing something that was clearly in his case, a positive thing? I mean, that must have been just awful being arrested for that.
Well, it was quite devastating because Robert had started to get things back together. He'd been hired as a professor at a nearby college, and he was teaching speech, and I was working, and we were young. We were 28 years old, something like that, and we were building our lives together, and then bam, we're busted, and of course we hadn't told our parents.
No, of course not.
We were using this for Bob's eyesight, and when we did, they were like, "Oh God." I keep saying this, Mark, but it didn't exist.
Right. The concept didn't exist.
It didn't exist. And so, in retrospect, the job that Bob and I had was to create, to re-educate America that marijuana does indeed have medical use. And that's what we did.
If you think about it, the physicians that had actually used it as a medicine, they'd all passed away by that point. I mean, that generation was gone. So all you had was the information that the government gave us, which was it's bad, it's bad, it's bad.
Exactly right. Yes.
And so you start from scratch saying, hey, listen, It's not. Here we go.
Here we go. Here we go.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So did you have to repeatedly defend yourselves? Was this, I mean, was the case done and then you were able to use it and there were no more issues, or did you continually have to sort of defend your position?
That's a very good question. And we repeatedly had to defend our position. The federal government, again, understanding the context of the times, here was Bob Randall, a single individual, knocking at the door of the federal government saying, I need legal access to marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
This had not been conceived of within the ranks of the federal government's drug warriors. They
figured it was a done deal, right?
Right. It's all wrapped up.
Schedule 1, here we go. It's all good.
Right. Normal at that point in time, this was 1975, 76.
Mm-hmm.
Normal at that point had already, its reclassification lawsuit, which was filed in 1972, was already, 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So the government never expected a lone individual to say, well, I need this. And furthermore, I have this proof from UCLA saying I need this.
I think it's like David and Goliath, right? It's like one stone's going to...
think of this, And at the local level,
thought it would happen.
At the lower echelon level of the bureaucracies, the bureaucrats were quite sympathetic.
Oh, well, I know them. Yeah.
They wanted to help. But as it moved up the ladder in NIDA and FDA, oh my God, the red flags started going up all over.
Oh, of course they did. Yeah. Panic.
And then Bob gets marijuana, and Bob was extraordinarily articulate. He was so well spoken.
Well, you mentioned it. His vocation was speech, right? So he's a linguist. He's a person who deals in words.
His master's degree was in rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion.
couldn't have been a better person to be chosen for this, right? I mean, it's sad that he had to be the one that suffered with glaucoma, but oh my gosh, there could be no better person to be in the forefront.
It's the whole Greek god thing and all of that, tapping the person,
right.
So we managed to get it through despite the resistance, but then afterwards they expected Bob to just be quiet about this.
Well, my God.
Bob had other plans. And so they didn't like that. They didn't like that at all.
I can imagine.
They managed to take the supplies away from him on a couple of occasions.
Is that right?
That is correct, yeah.
Oh.
And those are the only occasions in the 25 years that he had legal access to marijuana that there was a recordable deterioration of his eyesight. And finally, after a couple of those, in May of 1978, we managed to procure the pro bono services of one of Washington's largest law firms, and they mounted a case against the government that was brilliant. So much so that on the day it was filed, the U.S. attorney who was assigned to read it, and the whole case was settled in 48 hours. Is
that right? It was that much of a open and shut case?
Right. We never went to court.
They'd never be able to defend their position.
No, they wouldn't. And if we won, it would have opened the doors irrevocably, I think, to other medical marijuana patients. And when the lawyers came to us and said, well, they want to settle, both Bob and I were, well, no, if we settle, others won't get it. But of course, lawyers, they look out for their client.
Sure, they do.
And that, I understand that. But we wanted to go to court. But finally, we agreed. And the government really never bothered us after that. There were one or two situations where there was kind of a mix-up with the shipment. Got delayed for one reason or another. But they never took it away from him again.
So the federal government supplied you with medical marijuana.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so they would just mail it to you? It sounds kind of crazy, right? Because it's federally illegal. They're so crazy about transporting this stuff across state lines.
They never mailed it directly to Bob. Yeah, and there were just such silly things. For several years, he got it from a doctor at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And they made that doctor buy a safe that was bolted to the floor in his office. And
it blows me away. You can get down to the liquor store and you can get a bottle of poison that has no safety cap. Bring it home and put it on the counter.
It gets better. They made this poor doctor go through all of these things. Expense. That was significant expense.
Sure.
For the safe bolted to the door, to the floor. And then they would mail it to him by Federal Express. I mean, so it was just crazy. And then, so he got it from doctors like that for probably about 10 years. The doctors changed, but the method didn't. And then eventually we managed to get it into a pharmacy in Washington, D.C., where Bob, he was the only one getting it there, but he would go to that pharmacy because it was close to his home. And then when we relocated, as it were, back to Florida in 1995, it actually went to a pharmacy compounding company in Florida near Sarasota. And they would personally deliver it each month to Bob.
Now, was it hard to find a company that was willing to do that? Or were they pretty open to sort of, once they knew who you were and, and Bob and, he had access to it?
Yeah. It really wasn't in our case, but that was because we knew somebody who knew somebody. It was that sort of thing.
Right.
And so that were, to have called up cold phoning and to try to find somebody that way. I don't think we could have done that, but in that particular case, it worked out rather easily for us, and they were very faithful. So they were very good.
Right. Once they
because they stopped harassing Bob, but they would harass the pharmacy, or they would harass the doctor. So the harassment didn't end. It's just that they realized that, hey, this guy's just he's gonna run. This
guy's untouchable. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's got this big law firm, and so we better not go after him. Yeah.
Yeah. So they make it a little more difficult.
They did. Yeah.
So you are a nurse.
I became a nurse after Bob died in 2001.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, I needed a break from the medical cannabis stuff. Bob and I had been at it for 25 years. It had been a very emotional journey for us.
Yeah.
We'd have helped a lot of people, but we'd lost a lot of people to cancer, to HIV/AIDS, and then Bob, and then the biggest loss of all was Bob, who had AIDS and died in 2001. And so I will always be grateful to him that he did not extract, a deathbed kind of, carry on the good fight, for medical marijuana. He didn't do that. And I bless him for that. Because I just needed to step back.
Well, I can't imagine the harassment and just the going through that whole process of having to deal with the government. I mean, and then, as you say, there were a lot of people that you became friends with and touched and and worked with and lost. Yeah, that's got to take its toll.
The movement had matured significantly, and so I didn't feel that I knew that the movement was moving forward and it was in good hands. And so I was kind of at sea for a while, as widows or widowers often are. And I wasn't a nurse at that time. And I was having a little pity party lunch one day with my sister and, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And she said, well, if you could do anything at all, what would it be? And I immediately said I'd work for hospice. It just poof,
like
came
that.
out of my mouth. Yeah. And she said, well, what's stopping you?
Now, is that because of the experience that you had with Bob? Was he on hospice? How did hospice appear for you?
Yeah, he was on hospice, as had been both of my parents, and others that we've known along the way. But yes, Bob was on hospice, and so that was definitely part of it. But my first experience was with my father, and I was just so impressed with the concept,
right,
and the services that were provided. My mother-in-law was on hospice. She died in 1998, and Bob's mother. And she's the only one I know who really took full advantage of hospice when she received the diagnosis that she had colon cancer and it was terminal. There was nothing they could do. She immediately said, well, let's sign me up for hospice. And
I have a hospice background myself. I was on the board of the largest hospice, nonprofit hospice in Massachusetts. And so it's near and dear to my heart. And I know that that's really unusual. Most people wait to the last moment. And it really goes to, you don't want to give in, right? You don't want to say, okay, I'm on my way out. I recognize it and I'm going to say it. So they wait to the last minute and they miss out on this 6-month benefit that can be renewed, right? So to your mother-in-law's benefit, she dove right in. And oh my gosh, it changes everything.
Yes, that impressed me too, because I had no idea. My father, I think he'd been on hospice for 5 days. My mother.
That's the usual. It's like 2 to 5 days. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah. Then along comes my mother-in-law, Thelma, and she's on it for like 9 months.
Amazing.
And she loved to gamble, and she went to Las Vegas at one from Sarasota, Florida. And the local hospice arranged with the hospice in Las Vegas.
Oh my gosh.
That if Thelma went through some kind of crisis, they would be there for her. Well, the peace of mind that gave her. I mean, she
was able to get another trip to Vegas and do what she loved to do, right?
It was wonderful. And so these words came out of my mouth, and my sister kept saying, well, what's stopping you? And I said, well, I'm not a social worker. I don't have that kind of college degree. I'm not a nurse. And she said, well, what's stopping you? Can you tell she's my older sister?
I was going to say, yeah, she's unstoppable. She's okay. Alice, what's stopping you?
And I said, well, I can't go back. At this point, Mark, I'm 53 years old. I can't go back to school for 3 years to become an RN, you know? And she said, well, I have a friend who's just gone through a year-long course, and he's become something called a licensed practical nurse, an LPN.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I think I can do a year. And so I did. And then I graduated. And then, of course, I learned that hospice wouldn't hire me right away. I had to pay some dues as a nurse. You know?
Right.
So I had, that was actually turned out great too. I worked in the ER for 9 months. And then I got on with Florida cancer specialists for almost a year. And then hospice would look at my resume. And so I worked for hospice. I joined in 2006 and worked with them until 2012.
That's a nice career.
It was wonderful. I really do believe that hospice is a calling. It's.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you for the people that are working in hospice, it is a calling.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's not for everyone. You have to have that you have to be okay that people pass away.
Yes, you do.
And for the folks that I know that are in it, they provide love, they're there at the end and they provide love to that family member and to the other family members of the person who's making that journey. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful experience for me. But then the company I worked for was going through budget cuts and I got laid off in 2012, the day before my 65th birthday. I got laid off.
Oh my gosh.
I could not face looking for another job. And so I retired. And around this time, I had started to get speaking invitations from cannabis groups in Michigan, California, and that kind of thing, to talk about the history, to talk about Robert. And so I decided, well, I'll just ease my way back into medical cannabis.
Yeah.
And so I did.
And the time is right. And that's and we actually met at the American Cannabis Nurses Association conference, which was held in December of last year. And it was, how's it feel to look out over, this group of nurses that are dedicated to cannabis as a medicine, coming from where you guys came from? And here we are now in 2020, the cat's out of the bag. Everybody knows that cannabis is a medicine.
The cat is out of the bag.
It's irrefutable.
It's hard for me to articulate that feeling. Except to say that Bob and I, we always knew you'd be there. We knew that if we just kept at it, if we just kept telling the truth, that you would be there, that the reformers would be there, that the patients would be there, that eventually the healthcare practitioners would be there. And it's no surprise to me that the nurses are the first healthcare practitioners to organize and to be there in mass, a growing mass, I might add.
Fast growing.
Right.
And it is. And it's no surprise. I agree. It's no surprise to me that it's nurses who are at the forefront of this. And I really think it goes to just the nursing practice itself, right? So we're that holistic provider. We bring everything together for that patient, whatever they need, right?
Absolutely. And I think nurses as a whole have more flexibility than other healthcare providers. And so a cannabis nurse is able to adapt to really a rapidly changing landscape, because between the laws and the research, things are always, it's a constantly moving chessboard.
Isn't it?
Yes. And so it's no surprise to me that nurses are the first ones on the front line.
On the front line.
And God bless all of you.
I know. And it's, I love the fact that you decided at 53 or 54 to go back to school and become a nurse. I graduated with my nursing degree at the age of 54. So, for those folks who are listening who are on the further end of the life spectrum, it's never too late. You can always do whatever it is that you want to do.
Exactly. And in terms of nursing, I had no idea how many opportunities it would give to me beyond having a regular paycheck.
I know.
I've been on at least 5 medical missions. I've gone to Africa. I've gone to India. I've gone to South America.
And how was that? How was that traveling?
Oh my God, it was fantastic. And you go into countries that you can't say, well, get them out for a CAT scan. Let's see what's going on here. Or what's his blood work saying? You don't have those.
You don't have the tools.
You don't have the tools. You have the one tool. You have your brain, and your heart. You have the two necessary tools to be a nurse. Right. You have your brain and your heart, and so you are working in a way that, oh my gosh, it was so rewarding. And I loved every minute of it, and some of which were very hard in terms of travel for an aging body.
I can imagine. Africa's, that's not easy travel. India.
India was, I remember a particularly grueling 9-hour ride in a very cramped Toyota SUV. That was really jolted my back to places that had never been before.
Oh no!
But that's a story for another day.
Yes.
My point is, nursing. If you're listening and you're thinking about becoming a nurse and you think you're too old, you're not.
You're not, and you're needed.
Yeah.
You are sorely needed.
Yeah.
Now, when you were in hospice, was there any cannabis being used as a medicine at that point? Because it's really, that's a space where I see it being utilized very in a very positive way in the hospice space for people at end of life who I've had family members come back and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy we were able to use cannabis because it decreased the amount of opiates that my mom had to use, and she was much more aware." Like I had one family say, "Mom wanted to get up and go out and drive 2 days before she passed away."
Wow.
Like she was aware of what was going on, and she was with us right till the end.
Yeah.
Which is magical.
Yes. Well, a couple of different stories there. First of all, when Bob was nearing the end, he had terminal restlessness, which I know it's a phrase that you're familiar with.
I am.
As a hospice nurse, but for those who aren't hospice nurses, there is a period of time just before you die when you become, or not necessarily, but some patients become extraordinarily restless.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of anxiety. And it's understandable because there's so many changes taking place.
Sure.
And one of our goals in hospice is to calm that restlessness, to calm that anxiety. And in Bob's case, he had very severe terminal restlessness. And hospice threw everything at him. Ativan,
the regular litany of things.
And it wasn't working. And I finally, I took one of his federal marijuana cigarettes and I lit it up and I laid down next to him on the bed and I would take a puff and I would blow the smoke towards him so that he could inhale it. He was basically unresponsive at this point and couldn't smoke himself. And so I would blow the smoke towards him. And Mark, the physical response that he had to that was overwhelming. My sister was with me at the time. It was very late at night or early morning, depending. And he had been so restless, and I blew this marijuana smoke in his face, and you could see his body just relax. So much so that my sister gasped because she had watched me as I gave him the Ativan and everything else that didn't work. And so that's one story. But then when I was working in the hospice house as a nurse, this is in Florida. We did not yet have medical cannabis in Florida, so it wasn't legal. But we had several patients who came in who either brought their own or then their loved ones would come in and bring marijuana. And most of them were smoking it. And we would just be very tolerant of it. And we would ask them if they did want to smoke. Each room had a little patio that they could go out on and smoke out there. Or if they couldn't get out of bed, we would ask the loved one to close the door and put a towel so
it wouldn't seep out. Yeah,
didn't bother others. The doctors were very okay with it. The nurses were okay with it. The hardest part was figuring out how do you document this?
Yeah, I know. You can't necessarily document it, as it really is.
That was a big problem. And so I think we were into don't ask, don't tell.
Yes.
Just, or whatever that phrase is. I don't know.
That's it. Yeah. Don't ask, don't tell. Yeah. That's
right.
it.
But yes, there was definitely cannabis use in hospice when I was working there from 2006 to 2012.
And it's just, it's so good to see that it is being used now.
And that a more formal recognition of it.
Absolutely.
That brings me great joy. Yes.
It's so, to your point, your experience with Bob in the terminal restlessness, and it just worked.
Yes.
And it just worked for him.
Yeah.
And it works for a lot of other people. Yes. You wrote a book recently.
I did.
You did. Tell me about your book. I have a copy. I have a signed copy, and I've read it, and I love it.
Oh,
but for the listeners, you wrote a book.
I did. It's a book on CBD. It's called Pain Free with CBD. And the co-author is my good friend Eloise Thiessen,
who's a
who is
marvelous practitioner in California.
Practitioner and currently president of the American Cannabis Association.
Yes, she is.
Yes. And so there's a story behind that book. The publishers contacted me in June of 2019 and said, we would like you to write a book for us on CBD. And I was initially like, oh, I don't have time to, writing a book is a big job.
Yes, it is.
And they said, we have the outline all together for this book. And this is a company called Callisto Media. It's a modern day publishing company. They determine what topics are of interest to people at the current time. And then they kind of drill down deeper and do all the demographics and whatnot. And they determined that what was needed was a beginner's book for boomers, if you will. A book that would explain CBD to the senior citizens of
I do a lot of educational speaking events, and it happens to be mostly in residential assisted living facilities.
Right.
Everybody wants to know, what about this?
What's this CBD stuff?
Because on average, they're, people in that age range, and I'm on the end of the boomer, like I'm the last probably 2 years of the boomer generation. And they're on, 5 medications, right? Polypharmacy. Most of the time when you get up to into that age range, you've got stuff going on, right?
Right.
Yeah, I know I do. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they told me that. They sent me a complete outline of the book, right down to how many words would be in each section. And I'm a writer by trade at this point, and speaker, of course. And so I looked at it as a challenge. And I already knew a little bit about CBD. I have to say the only thing that made me worried about doing the book was that everyone will regard me as a CBD expert. And honestly, I don't call myself that. I'm a writer. I'm a researcher. I'm constantly wanting to learn, but there is so much to learn about CBD and all the other cannabinoids.
You said it earlier. You said it's like it's a shifting sands of knowledge, right? New research comes out. I mean, in this exciting field, every day there's something new that comes out.
Right. So, it's like trying to grab Jell-O,
Right.
And so I was nervous about that part, but I liked the challenge. And so we got it together. I started working on it in late June, and it was published by December 19th. It was quite a chore.
Wow.
I'm pleased with the book. I think they accomplished their goal of creating a good beginner's CBD book. And I'm very grateful to Eloise for her help on the drug interaction chart that we included, as well as her review of the disease categories. It's limited to diseases that can cause pain. It's not a be all end all everything.
How could it be? I mean, it's so the possibilities are so vast. You could go in so many different directions.
Right, but I am pleased with it, and it's doing quite well in terms of sales. And I'm enjoying speaking about it, and I'm enjoying that audiences seem to appreciate that. I'm not an expert, but I'll try to answer their questions. And it's that old thing, Mark. If you speak at groups, you probably say the same thing. Look, if I don't have the answer, you come up and give me your name and I'll and your email, and I'll get the answer for you.
Yeah. If there is an answer, sometimes the answer is we don't know.
That's the truth.
We don't know. That was something that was surprising. I was at a medical marijuana convention in Tel Aviv last September, and I was surprised that a lot of the research that's being done is around CBD as opposed to THC, which is the intoxicating one that everybody knows about or associates with marijuana use. A lot of the research that's being done these days is really around the non-intoxicating CBD cannabinoid, which was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah, I think there's two reasons for that. First of all, of course, CBD is the most abundant cannabinoid in
Hmm.
the cannabis plant, so that's one reason. But I think with the easing of the hemp laws, both in this country and in Europe,
Hmm.
it's easier to access CBD legally.
Yeah.
And so I think that's leading to more research. I'm excited about CBG, G is in George,
Right.
CBG research. I have recently started using CBG tincture for leg cramps that I get at night, which are, I think, predominantly due to I have peripheral vascular
Hmm.
disease because I have very small veins in my legs. And I would get cramps at night. And I have to say, the CBG has been pretty amazing in terms of alleviating those. So I'm all of it. CBG, CBN, CBC,
All of
CBD.
these, yeah, all of these precursors. Yeah.
Mark,
Hmm.
cannabis strikes me as this. It's like a unit. It's like a galaxy. The galaxies are ever expanding. There's always these explosions and things
Right.
happening, and it goes out and out and out. And the explosions are our gaining of knowledge,
Hmm.
and then it just goes out and out and out. And that's how I view cannabis at this point. And I'll have reformers say to me, "Well, when do you think we'll have it all done?" We'll never have it all
Never.
done.
Never. It's never going to be done.
There is no silver bullet law. There is no silver bullet research. It's just, it's going to be a never ending story for all of us with
Hmm.
nothing but good consequences as a result.
Right.
That's my theory.
Right. That's what that's what really drew me to it was the fact that the side effects are just so minimal in
Yes,
comparison to everything else that we in medicine have as tools. That the profile, the side effects are so minimal that there's just upside to trying it, right?
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Take a break here.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. I have to do something. Excuse me.
Okay. So the book is doing well. You're doing well. You're doing a lot of speaking.
Mhm.
It sounds like it's just really a nice time right now.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah.
It's a very nice time right now.
Hmm.
And, I'm so grateful that I've lived long enough to see what has happened with the cannabis movement. I of course, wish that Bob had lived long enough to see this and to the discoveries relative to the endocannabinoid system, period.
Period. I think, I really think that is going to be, we'll look back 50 years from now and say that was a moment in healthcare unlike any other. Like it was
I
a moment in time and a
I think
discovery.
I think it's going to go down in history as one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century.
I agree. I agree.
We haven't given it its due yet. We're starting.
No, we're at the forefront. I mean, how exciting is that you and I, get to be at the forefront of this massive discovery in healthcare that we don't even appreciate. You and I do, of course, but other folks just don't appreciate how big this is.
They're just starting to learn about it.
Yes.
So it is nice to see so many people coming into the movement, or just so many people coming to the knowledge that cannabis does have medical value.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to, like you mentioned, the ACNA conference last December, to go to an event like that and to have so many people say so many warm and kind things, and that validates at least one particularly hard decade, the first decade of the movement with Bob and I. It was a lonely time, very lonely time.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure people looked at you guys and said, "Are you just crazy?
Yeah, sure.
You're just hippies. You just,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And to have that validated, it is a wonderful feeling. I feel very blessed to be here at this moment. Yeah. Yes.
Mm. And we're thankful that you and Bob, we're thankful that you persevered.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And how many millions of people now benefit from that?
Yes.
It's simply amazing. Absolutely amazing.
That's the truth.
It is. It is. And we go on from here.
Yes, we do.
Any last thoughts that you'd like to share at this moment?
Well, since this is the Nurse Mark show, I would direct this to particularly cannabis nurses, that there is some patience needed when you enter. And I mean that as having the patience to do something, not patience as we care for people.
Right.
I hear a lot of nurses impatient with things, and they feel that change should come more quickly. Of course, it should come more quickly, but it doesn't. Get over it.
It doesn't. Right. It really doesn't. I mean, it's frustrating though, isn't it? Because we see how beneficial this is. We know, but
yeah, we do. Of course it is. But Bob always used to kind of shut down impatient people with this comment of, well, it took physicians 150 years to realize they should wash their hands. And Galileo was under house arrest because, for I think, I don't remember how many years, but for a long time, because he just said that we revolve around the sun, not the other way around. Things
heresy.
And medical cannabis is still heresy to a lot of people.
It is.
That's the other important thing. The other thing, just because you embrace medical cannabis doesn't mean that the next person is going to embrace it that easily. It doesn't happen, folks.
It doesn't.
So, yeah.
Think about it. It's been 80 years of negative marketing, and that's what people have been immersed in. It's hard to turn that around.
And even more, Mark. I mean, you can trace bigotry to cannabis back to 1500s when the witches were burned at the stake because they were using cannabis potions.
Mm-hmm.
So to my nursing colleagues, be cognizant of all of that. Be patient. Realize that you're at the forefront of something, and I'd love to see you all in private practice and making a living at it, but it's going to take a while.
It is going to take a while.
It's going to take a while before the physician that you love so much that you're working with begins to embrace what you believe, and just continue to believe, and one step at a time.
Words of wisdom from a person who's had to be patient.
Yes, indeed.
Since the 70s. Yes.
Yeah.
What an amazing story, Alice. And so I'm so very thankful that you spent this time with me on this podcast and shared a little bit of your story. Let me ask you, I do these deep questions with Nurse Mark at this point in the show. Okay. What's your most treasured memory? I know.
Gosh, from the full 40 years, my word.
I know.
Well, I think probably the period of time from 89 to about 94, 1989 to 1994.
Mm-hmm.
There were some people during that period of time. Steve Loop, AIDS patient from Texas. Barbara and Kenny Jenks, AIDS patients from Panama City Beach, Florida. Numerous other AIDS patients. and of course Bob had AIDS. Bob was bisexual, and that's how he contracted AIDS. And it's astonishing to me that I never got AIDS, but I'm blessed there too. But I think that period of time when we were able to really unite the AIDS community behind the concept that cannabis was a really potential and beneficial medication for them. And we had the help of these, especially these first 3-4 runners, Steve Loop and Barbara Kenny. That period of time was so emotional, so rewarding. We also managed in that period of time, we had a benefactor who funded all of our travel and our activities. And it was through his name was Richard J. Dennis from Chicago. And we were able to start the Marijuana AIDS Research Service, which allowed AIDS patients to easily apply for federal supplies of marijuana. So many applied that the federal government shut the program down and just essentially said to AIDS patients, well, drop dead. We don't really care.
That was the feeling at that moment in the AIDS community, right? I mean, it just basically government said,
overall.
Hey,
yes.
Sorry, you got it.
Right. And then when we had made this very easy way for AIDS patients to apply for for legal medical access, and the federal government slammed the door on that, that crystallized it. And the federal government totally misread the support that medical cannabis had in the United States of America at that point in time, because countless newspapers from around the country editorialized against it was Bush Sr., who President George H.W. Bush's administration that shut that down. And then that crystallization of that movement. That
wasn't one of his 1,000 points of light, by the way.
It seriously was not.
That's awful. That's just an awful thing to do.
It was. But it was that moment that led to the energy that Dennis Perrone and the activists in San Francisco had to go on and pass Prop P, which was a citywide ordinance allowing medical use of marijuana legally. And of course, that led directly to Prop 215. And so I look back on that emotional period, and
that was, for those who don't know what that was when California as a state in 1996 passed the Compassionate Care Act. Is that what it was?
I
think that was like the first state that said, hey, marijuana has a medical purpose and we're okay with that.
Yeah, it was the first state law passed by ballot.
Yeah.
Which was really impressive.
Yeah, because that's the will of the people, right? It's the people saying, hey, listen, we don't care if you believe it, we believe it, and we're going to make it legal.
Right, exactly. And so that moment was, that time was the most emotional, or the most memorable to me. If I had to choose one moment, I recall working at Normal. We convinced them to set up a medical reclassification project in early 1977. And I recall a phone call from a gentleman. One of the first phone calls I got, he lived in South Dakota. He had heard that marijuana might help his wife who had cancer. And he didn't know how to get it. And so he walked into his local bar in South Dakota, small town, and said, my wife is sick with cancer. I need to find some marijuana because it will help her tolerate her cancer treatments. And he went out and to go home, and on the seat was a bag with marijuana in it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Those, and I that's one, I have so many of those little tiny moments. The man also from the Midwest who got marijuana for his wife and was watching her eat watermelon, the first food she'd eaten in 5 days, because she'd smoked marijuana and could keep food down.
Could keep food down.
Those little moments are what really kept Bob and I going. Talking to the patients, taking, it was like a food source to us.
It is, right?
Recharging the batteries.
Yeah. Because it's a drag.
Oh, it was so hard some days.
So hard.
Yeah.
And those things recharged.
Yes, for sure. Sure.
And here we are.
And here we are.
And here we are. In a brave new world where cannabis is allowed.
In a lot of places.
Not as many as there will be.
Not as many as there will be.
It's coming soon to a neighborhood around you.
I hope so.
I do too. And that's why we do what we do, right? That's why we're in this. That's why we're here. Yep. And Alice, again, thank you so much for all that you've done for everyone who's involved in this, from the patients to the people, to the nurses who are working to help folks benefit from this miraculous plant, which we know is a miraculous plant. And thanks again for being a guest on the Nurse Mark podcast.
Well,
keep the faith. We'll see. I'm going to see you soon, I'm sure. And hey, folks, thanks for tuning in. And that's a wrap. Well, that's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Nurse Mark podcast. Alice O'Leary Randall, so much history, so much of her life dedicated to helping people use cannabis, marijuana, effectively as a medicine. An amazing story and an amazing person. Thanks again for listening to this week's episode of the Nurse Mark podcast. And this is Nurse Mark saying health, happiness, cannabis.